Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to our webinar titled Utility Rate Cases 101, How Local Governments Can Address Rising Electricity Prices. This is the fourth webinar in WRI series on local government engagement with utilities and state public utility commissions. If you missed our earlier webinars, we encourage you to view them online. Over the next hour, we'll walk through the basics of rate case proceedings, highlight how local governments can participate as large energy users and spokespeople for their communities, and hear from a practitioner about their experiences intervening in rate cases. For those who are new to rate cases, they are technical and nuanced, so we won't have time today to do a full deep dive into the details of rate making, but we do hope you leave today with a better understanding of the processes and how local governments can engage. Next slide. WRI is a global, nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization working to improve people's lives, protect nature, and halt climate change. We have a team of around 2,000 staff across 13 offices around the world. We work on topics like energy, water, forests, cities, food, and transportation. Today's webinar is led by staff from the Polsky Center for the Global Energy Transition, who focus on U.S. energy issues. Next slide. In today's session, we'll highlight the basics of rate case proceedings, including what they are and what gets decided. Having this base level knowledge of a rate case and the outcomes will tie into what local government should consider for how to engage in a local rate case. We will then be joined by staff from Ann Arbor, Michigan, to hear about their experiences intervening in rate cases. Throughout the webinar, we encourage you to drop questions that you have in the Q&A function. We'll do our best to address those questions during the Q&A portion at the end. Next slide. Today's speakers include myself, Jen Tribble, as the moderator, and two featured experts. Ian Goldsmith is a Clean Energy Research Associate with the U.S. Polsky Center at World Resources Institute. In this role, Ian conducts research on key topics in the energy sector, including load growth, utility business and planning processes, and clean energy tax credits. He shares materials and works directly with local and state governments to support the development and implementation of clean energy policies and projects. We are also joined by Dr. Missy Stoltz. Missy is the Sustainability and Innovations Director for the City of Ann Arbor. In this role, she works with all city operations, residents, businesses, the University of Michigan, nonprofits, and others to achieve a just to community-wide carbon neutrality by 2030, as outlined in the A20 Carbon Neutrality Plan. Next slide. Before diving into the material, we would like to disclaim that the rate-making process varies significantly by state, utility type, and individual utility. We cover high-level topics in this session focused on electric service utilities, but these processes may differ significantly in any one state or for any one utility. If you decide to engage in a rate case, we ask that you consult internal or external counsel before moving forward, and that this presentation should not be construed as legal advice. Next slide. So we'll start the conversation today with what a rate case is and why it matters. Next slide. So we're talking about what a rate case is, but why are we talking about this now? Everyone is talking about affordability, and much of that is being driven by people feeling squeezed by hikes on their electric or gas bills. These hikes are very real. The advocacy group Power Lines found that utilities requested nearly $31 billion in rate increases in 2025, which was more than double what was requested in 2024. And since 2021, electricity prices have increased by almost 40%. Experts have identified a number of complex factors behind these rate increases, including grid modernization efforts, infrastructure to serve large data centers and industrial loads, inflation, and natural gas price increases. Whatever the cause, though, we know that rates are going up across the country. Next slide. This has led to increasing interest in how electricity and gas rates are decided. We've seen action from state policymakers on issues such as data center large load tariffs, reform of certain utility rate making practices, and even governor or executive office involvement in rate cases. We've also seen more and more local governments interested by and even get directly involved in rate cases, often for the first time ever. Clearly, there's a growing interest in how electricity bills are set and a desire by governments that haven't been involved to learn more. So we'd love to hear from you about your interest in the next slide. So as our first pulse check, we'd love to know how closely you've been following electricity rate news in your community, all the way from very closely, it's a regular part of your work, all the way to not at all. This is a new territory for you. Looks like we've got a pretty experienced crowd today. We're seeing a lot of very closely and somewhat closely as the answers. Awesome. I think we can go ahead and close the poll and move to the next slide. A rate case is a formal quasi-judicial proceeding whereby a public utility seeks approval to change its rates charged to consumers by a regulatory body. Unlike for most goods and services, the prices a utility charges are subject to a civil or administrative law process overseen by a regulator, very similar to a court. This process occurs because utilities are what we call natural monopolies and don't face normal competitive market pressure. So we have government bodies to step in and ensure that utilities don't abuse their monopoly power. Rate cases allow utilities to seek approvals for their expenditures and adjust how much they charge consumers over time. The term rate case generally refers to larger proceedings that review base rates for all consumers. Base rates means the standard default rates that are baked into everyone's bills without any extra charges or program specifics. There are other proceedings that affect bills. For example, things like storm recovery costs, fuel adjustment charges, and environmental compliance. But for today's session, we're just focusing on the standard rate case process. Next slide. In this slide, we'll talk through the basics of rate case proceedings. A rate case will be requested by a utility when they believe that their current rates and revenues are insufficient to recover capital expenditures or to cover the cost of future services. How often a utility files a rate case depends on a number of factors that could include state law or previous regulatory proceedings. Rate cases may be filed as often as every year or as infrequently as every 5 years. Rate cases are typically lengthy processes and take place over approximately 8 to 11 months, but some may have longer or shorter timelines. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, rate cases are decided in front of special regulatory bodies that are specifically authorized to regulate the rates and services of utility companies. These are generally known as public service commissions or public utilities commissions, and they are composed of 3 to 7 appointed or elected commissioners. However, the name, makeup, and authorities of these regulatory bodies will vary between states. Generally, if we're talking about one of these regulatory bodies, we'll refer to them as a commission or PUC or PSC. One note to make here before moving on is that generally rates and services offered by publicly owned or membership cooperatively owned utilities are not regulated by a state commission. That means that they don't normally go through the rate case process that we're talking about today. They still will rate make, and many of the principles we'll talk about today still apply, but the process will look different for a publicly owned or co-op utility. Speaking of that process, you may be wondering how a rate case gets decided. Next slide. Rate cases generally follow a well-established process across the country. We're presenting a general process here, and again, individual states and utilities may have processes that look slightly different. So first, the utility will file an application with its regulator to increase rates and begin a rate case. The commission will then start proceedings and begin reviewing the application. As part of the rate case process, the commission will set up and hold public hearings where members of the public can express their views. The commission will also take written comments from the public. At the same time, various groups will petition the commission to be intervenors or formal parties to the rate case. This gives them rights to discovery, as well as to put forward testimony and expert witnesses. Intervenors in the utility will go back and forth in their testimony and eventually have the chance to participate in evidentiary hearings. Following this testimony and rebuttal, the utility and intervenors can enter settlement negotiations. So after this, how does a rate case end? Well, if you go to the next slide, rate cases can end in one of two ways. First, it's not uncommon for a rate case to end with a negotiated settlement between the utility and some or all of the intervenors in a case. The commission will then decide whether to accept in full or in part or reject the settlement. Second, if settlement negotiations fail or don't take place, the commission can fully decide the results, similar to a regular judicial proceeding. Whatever the case, the commission makes its final order on the rate case based on all of the testimony, hearings, and comments that it has received. Now that we've covered what a rate case is and why it matters, I'll go ahead and hand the presentation over to Ian to further discuss what's decided in a rate case.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen. So moving right along, Jen did an excellent job covering what a rate case is, and the general facts of how, where, and why it happens. But now we're gonna take some time to discuss what is or isn't actually being decided in a rate case. And before we do that, we want to take another poll just to gauge your own understanding of how rate cases work. So let's open that up now. All right, got folks coming in. All right. Looks like we actually have a crowd that has some knowledge or familiarity with the process. That's great. That's great. We'll just let it open, keep it open for a couple more seconds. All right, I think we can end the poll now. Looks like stuff is calming down. Great. Fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all that. So, we're going to start. It's great to see that people are at least somewhat familiar with the rate case process. We're going to start from the beginning. So, rate cases in the US predominantly operate using what's called the cost of service model. It's also referred to commonly as the rate of return model. You'll hear both within this world. Under the cost of service model, rates are based on enabling utilities to recover the total amount needed for the utility's operating and capital expenses, plus a reasonable rate of return on that capital. This figure represents the total cost of service for an investor-owned utility to continue providing its service, whether that be gas or electric or water or something else. The process of determining this cost of service, as well as subsequently what the customer pays to you, the utility, based on this cost, is called rate making. Rate cases center around rate making. It's in the name. I do want to note that what a rate case covers does actually vary between different jurisdictions. For example, some rate cases in certain states might have more relevance towards issues like resource planning, grid modernization, customer programs. This is particularly true if other processes like integrated resource planning don't exist in those jurisdictions. But generally, rate making and rates that people pay will be at the center of every rate case you find, no matter where you are. Rate making consists of three major parts, which are in order determining the revenue requirement, cost allocation, and rate design. We're going to go through all of these three steps in order, starting with the first one, That is determining the revenue requirement or cost of service. Next slide, please. Great. So, let's start from the beginning. Utilities are very capital intensive businesses. They need a lot of large, specialized, and expensive infrastructure like wires, like pipelines, like generation assets to provide customers with reliable, continuous service of goods that they need all the time without exception. So the first piece of a utility's cost of service is its capital expenditures. This is generally called its rate base. The rate base of a utility, formally, it refers to the total value of capital investments minus depreciation and other adjustments on which a utility is authorized to recover costs and earn its rate of return. This rate base mostly consists of the assets I was just talking about. They're referred to in industry jargon as plant, and this can cover a lot of different things, physical and digital infrastructure, from wires to poles to generation to customer meters to the office buildings that a utility has. It's everything, all the capital investments needed, plus or minus adjustments, that the utility needs to provide its service. But not all infrastructure is or can be part of the rate base. Generally, in order for investments to be recoverable, the plant must be used and useful, meaning physically operating or capable of operating, and that without the asset, the cost to ratepayers would be higher or the service would be worse. What's critical and unique about the utility business model is that utilities actually earn their return and profit on their rate base, on their capital expenditures. This means commonly that the more capital expenditures a utility has, the larger amount of return it can receive. Speaking of that return, if we go to the next slide, the rate of return describes the amount a utility is authorized by regulators to incur to finance its capital expenditures. For any of you MBAs or finance nerds out there, this is known as the cost of capital. It's also known as a weighted average cost of capital, taking into account both debt and equity. Return and rate of return and debt and equity and all that finance stuff can get technical and complicated really fast. But the biggest thing out of return, and the one that you probably heard of, is in that rightmost corner over there called return on equity. The most prominent and most important part of this rate of return piece. If we go to the next slide. The return on equity is the amount that a utility is authorized to collect from ratepayers as profit to distribute to shareholders. Remember, we're talking about in this presentation and in this rate case process, we're talking about private investor-owned utility companies, which means that their goal is to make a profit and continue attracting investment in the long term. Unlike a regular competitive market business, because of the monopoly structure of utilities, the amount of profit that a utility gets is directly authorized and monitored by the regulator. This concept is at the center of the investor-owned utility model and is what enables them to keep operating as a business. ROEs are expressed as a percentage representing the financial return on investment for a potential shareholder. They are set by regulators in order to balance between attracting sufficient capital for financing investments while maintaining affordable rates to consumers. In the US, ROEs generally range between 8 to 11%, mostly coalescing around 9 to 10%. Setting the ROE is one of the most critical and contested pieces of a rate case. you'll commonly find that utilities will suggest higher ROEs, while advocates will argue for lower ROEs. And pretty much anywhere with a rate case with private utility, you'll find discussion of ROEs. So we've talked about capital expenses and rate of return. However, utilities have more, things to think about within this. You have to have the day-to-day operations of a utility of providing service, and that costs money. If we go to the next slide, another piece of the expense puzzle, if we go to the next slide, there we go. Utilities have expenses that they need to incur in order to keep the business running and to keep, the lights on or, the heat going. This includes things like operations and maintenance, purchased power from or fuel from other businesses, salaries for employees, taxes, and more. What this means is that these expenses get have to be recovered, and they're often called just operating expenses by themselves. What's important here in thinking about the overall cost of service is that these expenses, unlike the capital, do not receive a rate of return. They are passed through directly to customers as is. So, what happens? I've talked about capital expenses, talked about rate of return, talking about operation expenses. What happens when we put them all together? Well, you get on the next slide the revenue requirement formula or the rate making formula. The rate making formula calculates the total amount a utility needs to cover or recover its expenses, aka its revenue requirement, which is then the basis for the rates that consumers pay. This formula shows us that the total revenue requirement, the amount of revenue a utility needs to continue operating, is equal to the rate base times an allowed rate of return plus any operating or other expenses a utility incurs. This formula is kind of at the center of utility rate making, and it will apply pretty much regardless of what service or ownership type a utility is. Even a publicly owned or membership utility might have to they have to finance their investments and think about things like return on things like bonds. This is a simplified version of the formula. If you look up rate making formula and try to look deeper, you'll find more complex versions of this that will highlight specific kinds of expenses and adjustments. But the general form, with capital expenditures getting a rate of return and other expenses just being passed through, that will still apply. I want to note that this formula is also generally calculated on a 12-month basis. This is often called a test year. That can be an actual year or a hypothetical future year using modeling. So decisions in rate cases may apply over multiple years, but traditional rate making processes focus on revenue requirements and rate making for a 12-month period. There are alternative rate making structures that account for multiple years worth of rates at a time, but that's outside of the scope of this presentation. So we've talked through revenue requirement and we're only at step one. Don't worry, the other steps will move a little bit faster. So the next step after determining the total overall amount a utility needs is cost allocation. It's recognized that not all customers have the same effect on the system. The amount and the kinds of costs that customers cause a utility to incur in order to provide their service will vary, sometimes tremendously. Residential customers look different than commercial customers, which look different than large industrial customers, which look different as street lighting, and they all impact the system in various ways. So, the goal of cost allocation is to try to distribute the utility's revenue requirement, aka the cost of service, across all customers according to their responsibility for those costs. You can see in the chart one model of how this is done. This is considered a particularly traditional model of cost allocation that divides costs based on their function, their classification as to what characteristics of energy consumption they address, and then finally what customer class they're causing. This process is what determines what the overall amount each customer class will pay. And I want to take a sec to highlight the importance of this process. If we go to the next slide, it is complicated, right? There's no one universally accepted formula or method or even framework for allocating costs. You'll see variations between different jurisdictions, different utilities, and even different methods being applied within the same rate case to different pieces of the utility system. But thinking particularly from the local government perspective, cost allocation is an important lever of influence because it determines the amount that different customers, different kinds of customers, will actually pay. And it also raises issues of fairness and equitable distribution of costs. Right now, this cost allocation is at the center of a lot of debates around things like data centers and large loads. Many advocates and communities are concerned that they could end up paying for the cost of infrastructure just that is designed primarily to support large load and data center facilities. Whether or not that is true, it's this process that would address questions and concerns like that, and where this work is actively occurring. So, we've with this process, we've determined what classes of customers should pay. How do you actually get them to pay that, though? Well, the third and the final step of rate making is rate design. After determining the overall revenue requirement and how those costs should be allocated among consumers, you need to create pricing structures to actually recover those costs from consumers through their bills. These rate structures are also called tariffs and or rate schedules. And this is what actually determines how to calculate a person's bill. Most rates these days are structured pretty similarly across customer classes. You'll see things like a customer charge that is charged per individual, entity, per individual customer in this class. You'll see a charge per amount of energy used. And for larger kinds of customers like businesses or industrial facilities, you'll see demand charges based on the peak demand, peak amount of energy at that the consumer is consuming, at its peak demand. In the modern era, however, rates also have to account for things like behind the meter solar and storage, EV charging, demand response programs, voluntary renewable energy purchasing, and more. For those programs, those technologies, things like the pricing, the compensation mechanisms, and the contract terms, all of that has to be put into a rate schedule or a tariff so that customers can actually use them. And you can't just set these rates willy-nilly. Rates are commonly across the US evaluated on a just and reasonable standard. There's a lot of statute and case law to determine what that means. And I'm not, really going to be able to go into it here. Generally, though, this refers to the idea that rates shouldn't be overly burdensome, discriminatory, or beneficial towards one or more classes of customers. So, uh, if we go to the next slide, I want to acknowledge that that was a lot. This is a complex technical and regulatory topic. So if you're, not sure about everything, if you feel like you don't understand something right now, that's totally fine. The biggest thing that I think I want folks to take away is that at its core, utility rates are based on enabling a utility to recover the total amount needed for covering its capital and operating expenses, plus an opportunity to earn a reasonable rate of return on capital expenses. The rate making process, therefore, involves determining that total amount, allocating the costs fairly between different customers, and designing the pricing structures needed to allow the utility to recover their revenue requirement from customers. I do want to emphasize at this point, after going through this, that rate making is both an art and a science. Yes, there may be complicated formulas or accounting concepts or industry jargon that gets thrown around and used, and these cases can get very technical very fast. But the decisions that are made here about rates, about these technical concepts are political in the sense that they are informed by law, by policy goals, by advocacy from particular interests. They are actively being made in these cases, overseen by commission. In a rate case, all of the process and the inputs to these processes that I just talked about, all this is up for debate. And you know, people will tell you that it's just as much of an art as a science. So, before moving to the next section, actually, let's move on to the next section. So I just kind of went through, what's decided, the basics of the rate making process, uh, but now I want to turn away from that and go towards what local governments should consider when they're thinking about engaging with rate making, with rate cases. For those of you who remember our past couple of webinars, we've talked before about the process for local governments of identifying opportunities, evaluating those opportunities, developing a strategy, and building buy-in to implement your goals. Today, we're going to focus on the earlier parts of that process as they apply to rate cases, namely evaluating rate case opportunities and starting to think about your strategy around them. First, before we do that, I want to do another poll question just as a refresh. If we go to the next slide, want to see if your local government, if you were a local government, how, if, and how you've engaged in rate cases. Okay, a lot of folks. Oh, this is great. Okay, great. Looks like the poll is slowing down a little bit. We'll just give it a couple more seconds for folks to come in, folks to add if they haven't already. Looks like we have folks with a fair amount of experience and um, you know, history with intervention, or at least, understanding and getting involved with these processes. All right, let's end ended this poll. Fantastic. So the first thing I want to talk about with rate case engagement is why get involved. Um, before going down the path of getting involved in something like a rate case, it's really important to think about how, as a local government or any other entity, it aligns with your goals. Doesn't make sense to really get involved with something this complex and potentially contested without ensuring it aligns with your priorities. Rate cases most clearly have an impact on affordability and equity. Makes sense. They have a direct impact on customer bills. But they also have reflect capital investments and have an impact on investments that affect afford sustainability, resiliency, and reliability. They also have address issues that may come up with specific projects or programs, not just that may be a part of overall rate making, plans or procedures. Ultimately, how relevant a rate case is to your broader goals is going to depend on what those goals are, as well as your individual state or utility context. For example, if you and your local government are really, really focused on clean energy, and that's the thing that you really want to work on the most, but you live in a state where your utility is unable to own its own generation, it's possible that, a rate case might not be your top priority for engagement. Um, so it's important to think about how, if you're considering rate case engagement, how it aligns with your goals. The next thing to think about is how you might get involved. If we go to the next slide, there's a real spectrum of engagement, that goes from encouraging or supporting other folks' engagement to meeting with stakeholders to express your priorities to actually making comments and at public hearings or form in written form to doing actual intervention either in a smaller rate-related docket or a rate case itself. And from the poll questions, seems like we've had folks, across this spectrum of engagement, which is great. While intervention is, by far the most powerful and impactful form of engagement out of all of these, it's also the largest commitment. And we'll talk about cost benefit analysis in just a sec, just in a minute. But the decision of how you want to be involved, along this spectrum ultimately rests with what your local government is comfortable with, and what your goals are. I want to take a second to highlight that, local governments are far from the only parties that get involved in utility rate cases and that you can work with or at least, talk to understand this process better. If we go to the next slide. Um, there are a bunch of different kinds of interveners, ranging from utility commission staff to state consumer advocates. To the state consumer advocates who work on behalf of the public interest in commission proceedings, to environmental and advocacy groups that may represent special interests, and even large industrial consumers like Walmart and Google. All of these interveners have their own interests that may or may not align with your local government priorities. Local governments also have a really special and unique role here. Their voice does matter in these proceedings. Local governments often provide a really unique dual perspective as representatives for their communities and their goals. That includes things like clean energy and affordability, but they're also large energy users themselves. We'll actually hear just in a little bit from Ann Arbor about how their voice and their perspective was welcomed, in as they got involved with rate cases. Understanding the matrix of who's already involved in your state or utilities rate cases will help you learn about what important issues are, will help you identify people who you might want to talk to, as well as, potentially partner or align with later down the line. Whatever your involvement is, though, you will have to evaluate and do a cost benefit analysis of whether or not it makes sense in the first place to get involved. If we go to the next slide, rate cases, as we've discussed, they're very important and pivotal opportunities to influence utility decision making and electricity prices for consumers. If, the benefits of getting involved, particularly as an intervener, can be really substantial. Interveners have influence over the rates that they or anybody that they represent pay on their bills, and they get to influence wider resource or programmatic or policy decisions, from utilities, right? But there are also real costs to involvement. It requires time, effort, and potentially, expense to get involved here. This is particularly true if you are intervening, which may or may not necessitate hiring outside counsel or expert witnesses to help support your arguments and your intervention. Getting involved may also strain any existing relationships that you have with the utility because you are getting involved in the process of how they make their money. Um, and because all of this is happening through a semi-judicial proceeding, your success and what you ultimately achieve is up to the commission at the end of the day. All of this means that you, as a local government, need to carefully weigh the pros and cons of getting involved. If you do choose to get involved, that also means coming up with a clear strategy for engagement that takes into account the political, with a small p, political considerations here. One way to start getting at this, if we go to the next slide, is thinking about what you want to focus on. We don't have the time to go through the full development of a strategy. We'll also hear more about strategy from Ann Arbor. But if a local government does decide to get involved somehow in a rate case, it's important to keep in mind what the goals are, and what parts of the rate cases impact most directly those goals. Rate cases are big proceedings with a lot of different components, so prioritizing which issues matter for you can really help to guide your engagement as well as create any internal buy-in that you need to get involved. There are a lot of different areas to focus on, like ROE, clean energy use, energy efficiency. And there's another common strategy is scrutinizing specific investments and their ability to provide benefits to the community. So, kind of wrapping up this section, there are a lot of considerations that you need to think about, and we've really only scratched the surface of what a local government would need to consider when getting involved in a rate case. Pulling it together, you can start thinking about rate case engagement, through goal alignment, through cost benefit analysis, through strategy, and through logistical frameworks. We are getting a little short on time, so I'm not going to go fully through the slide, but the slides will be shared later, so you can reference all of this information on your own time. So with that, we're going to turn it over to our guest for today, Dr. Missy Stoltz. Thank you so much for being here, and I don't want to take up more of your time, so go ahead, Missy.
All right, let's do it. And just open these screens. And Valerie Jackson is with me. I'm going to ask her to pop on camera too. Thumbs up. We're good to go. All right, everybody. Welcome to Ann Arbor. If you don't know where we are the hand state, and Ann Arbor is hanging out right over here where that star is. Lovely Michigan. Just want to give you a little context. And as Ann was talking about understanding, I'm going to kick us off with some understanding about Ann Arbor and our goals, which really inform why we intervene and the issues that we take on in interventions. So for us, there's a lot of reasons, but this is my job, and it's called A20. I am the director of the Office of Sustainability and Innovations, and it is my job to figure out how our community is going to achieve a just transition to community-wide carbon neutrality by 2030. So tomorrow. And in the arc of that work, there are a lot of things we have to do, right? These are our core strategies. The first three are the energy strategies, and that's what we're going to center on today, although there's intersection in our interventions with these other issues too. So we've got to power our grid with renewable energy. We've got to do beneficial electrification. We have to do energy efficiency. We're working on land use. It does come into play a little bit in land use, especially when we're thinking about tearing up our streets and what we put where and how we build out the infrastructure we want. So that does shape some of our interventions. Circular economy is key in the work that we do. And of course, resilience, right? And our energy system, at least where I happen to sit, isn't a particularly resilient one. And so this is a pain point that we try to solve for. And then our last strategy that guides a lot of our A20 work, holistic work, are strategies or actions that belong in all of those other categories: transparency, engagement, equity work, right? So I share this just to kind of ground what we're doing. And as just a little bit more background, we know in our work that we hear commonly, time and time again, there's a lot of complexity in doing this. There's complexity in terms of the landscape. It's complicated to figure out who to call, who to trust, what to do, what are my options, what is the funding that's out there. It's complicated to understand how you address the upfront cost. Energy costs are rising astronomically. I sit, as does VJ, in a part of the country where electric rates are so much higher than gas rates. We are one of the slivers where beneficial electrification has a cost burden. So we're trying to solve for that. And that requires a very different approach and thinking about how we generate our energy and how we do that in a way that's sustainable for residents today, but also future generations. And then we also hear that people just aren't familiar with the tools and the tech that we talk about. The below in green boxes, I just wanted to indicate, I'm going to talk to you in a second, and VJ is going to talk a little bit about interventions, but we're doing a bunch of things. The interventions are a piece of an ecosystem. They are not the ecosystem in and of themselves. And because we do all of these other green bubbles down here, we are much better informed to go into our interventions. So on that, we're working on those regulatories of those barriers of the landscape's complex. I don't know where to start. It's expensive, but we also have these regulatory and legal barriers. And so I want to pause. Valerie Jackson is an attorney in our city, and she is our attorney in sustainability, which was a strategic hire because we know laws need to be changed. And there are many of them. And I want to applaud the lawyers out there who sit in local government and don't ask, can I do this? But ask, how can I do this? And that is what I have in a partner in crime in Valerie Jackson. And so we do work on laws. And of course, here today, we're talking about regulations. And so we do spend a lot of time fighting for our constituents through regulatory proceedings. And that's because Ian said it, local government is powerful. We are not advocating for a technology. We are not advocating for one particular pathway. We are advocating for the people, for our businesses, for our residents. That is a unique perspective that has always been welcomed by our Public Service Commission here in Michigan. It's a PSC, by them in the discourse. And I want to name, we don't intervene on issues we don't have knowledge about, but we are uniquely positioned to talk about the lived experience and ramifications of not investing in maintenance, not coordinating with local governments and the pain points those cause, not investing in renewable energy at a scale that the science indicates is necessary, right? So we don't try to take on everything, but we do take on what we uniquely can take on. For us, we started our first intervention in 2020, minus a little like blip in there. We've pretty much intervened every year. So we intervene in rate cases. We've done IRPs. We've done green pricing programs. We've also done some gas cases, and I'm going to take you through that in a second, but I'm going to stop and share. I don't get to share this good news. I'm going to let Valerie Jackson share some of the good news of what we've succeeded in getting through our interventions. BJ, over to you.
Thank you, Missy. Some of our biggest wins have been on things like requiring utilities to coordinate with local governments and other utilities in an effort to find cost savings and efficiencies. And this is something that we started going before the commission, telling them we really think coordination is going to be beneficial. When the streets open for municipal work, we should also be having the utility come in to do the work that they need done. And the first response from the commission was, yeah, that's a good idea. You should do it when you can. And then the next year we went in a little harder on it, and it was like they kept getting more specific, and we just got an order that's requiring them to actually actually track when they look at capital improvement plans to actually have accountability for looking for ways to coordinate to save ratepayers money by combining resources, letting the city will pay for resurfacing instead of the utility. So the city was going to do that work anyway. Why have ratepayers pay for it for the utility to dig the road up again to do their work? So that's been a really big area of focus for the city the past few years. We've also had some wins in street lighting. A few years ago, the street lighting rates were set up such that street lighting customers, like cities, were being charged as if their street lights were in working order 100% of the time. And we went in and we actually partnered with a municipal association, a coalition, and said, we have all this data showing that streetlights are actually not working like 4% of the time. And the commission ended up lowering the sales forecast for street lighting, which resulted in lowered street lighting rates for all municipalities in our state that have our utility. So that was a great win. Also, we've done a lot of work on tree trimming and other maintenance activities. We've, as was mentioned earlier by Ian, utilities their shareholders earn a return on capital expenditures. They don't earn a return on maintenance activities. However, if the grid is well maintained, if the trees are trimmed, there are going to be fewer capital expenditures needed down the road. You need to maintain your equipment. And we found that our utility had practices in place where they were sort of skimping on maintenance to save money in the short term, but in the long term, that resulted in more capital investments, which meant more money for shareholders, and the ratepayers were paying that. And we've gone in a lot to argue about this, or kind of shed light on the utility preference for capital over O&M, when O&M is what is better for the ratepayers and for the grid, the health of the grid overall. We recently have a utility that spent almost a decade trying to catch up on their tree trimming cycle. Finally got to a place where they're going to be on a regular 5-year cycle. And they went in the last rate case saying, you know what, we want to do a variable cycle. Some of our it's only be trimmed every 6 or 7 years. On average, it'll be a longer cycle, but we think it's okay. And a bunch of interveners said, no, we don't think so. We were the only intervener that said, in addition to requiring our utility to stay on a 5-year cycle because it's been proven to prevent outages, we also would like the commission to require the utility to track outages by circuit, especially for, particularly for those circuits that are past that 5-year cycle. We need them to track tree-related costs on those, tree-related costs due to outages on those circuits. And the commission adopted our recommendation, and now the utility has to track those costs, and the commission put them on notice that that can be taken into consideration in the future when they determine whether their costs are reasonable. So if they decide not to follow this prudent tree trimming cycle, then we have a solid argument, we'll have data that those costs should not be passed on to ratepayers. So those are, I guess, overall, my summary, my advice would be, when you have an issue or if you see something being done by the utility and you think it doesn't feel right, ratepayers shouldn't be covering those costs. If there's a way to quantify them, ask the commission for a quantifiable disallowance. If you see a practice that really can't be quantified at this point, ask the commission to require tracking of that thing. So in the future, you will have the data to go in and ask for a specific quantifiable disallowance. It's much easier for the commission to give you a win if they have data to tie to a disallowance. Yeah, Missy, I don't know, do you want to go for it?
That's great. Yeah, I will end because I know we're almost at time by saying combined, we have a lot of issues that we intervene on, and we've saved over $1 billion, including last week. We got a ruling that was another $100 million worth of savings that Ann Arbor intervened. We're not talking about gas cases. I'm just putting this up. Gas is a really interesting space where we're fighting for kind of the utilities to really question why we keep sinking a lot of money into this particular asset that we think has no place in a climate safe future. So there's a whole different discussion over there. I know we're talking electric, but at the end, this matters. You matter, your voice, your experience. You are a unique intervener. You are close to the people and you can highlight their stories. If you've got climate goals, affordability goals, come off the bench, get into the game. You can get in a small, isolated way. This stuff is hard. You do not have to be an expert in all of it. You will not be an expert in all of it, and that is okay, but you are an expert in your lived experience in your local government. So cannot wait to hear your stories and cheer you on from the sidelines.
Awesome. Thank you, Missy and Valerie. We do have a time for a couple of questions. So we have a whole list and we can get to maybe a couple. I wanted to start by asking how you would suggest that city staff stay in the loop when rate cases are filed. So how do you hear about a rate case when it's filed, and then how do you track the proceeding?
BJ, do you want to take that?
Sure. I mean, in our case, we are fortunate that I work for the city, so I am on, the listserv, so I see when rate cases are filed or pending. And I always flag Missy and let her know, and then sort of ping some issues that might be of interest to her unit and then sometimes other units in the city. And if there are or are issues, I might reach out to other areas if I would like testimony from other folks throughout the city. And we always issue memos to our city council at the wrap up of rate cases to let them know sort of what we intervene on, what our results were, and then they might have asked for future rate cases of things to look out for, or things that are, to keep on our radar.
Great. Yeah, that's helpful. And good you have a streamlined process because it sounds like you have a lot of great cases to be following. Um, so thinking back to some of your early engagement in 2020, how did you and your staff learn about kind of the nuts and bolts of intervening in a rate case? And were there any specific cities or other local governments that you kind of learned from along the way?
Yeah, we used our networks to find out who else had experience and to kind of get skilled up. We went to a WRI workshop and we learned the basic processes. And then we were pretty lucky that one of the city attorneys, sustainability is such a novel area of work for most lawyers in government, that we had hired, we had a small contract and we had hired outside counsel to help us with some of the things we were working on. And this attorney was quite skilled in this area and so helped us navigate our very first intervention, which I almost read in advance of this and was like, no, I don't need that in my life. We've evolved. Let's just put it there.
That was before my time, and I got brought in and luckily got to come in-house. So now we still have that outside counsel helping on some things, but it's nice to have an inside perspective now.
Yeah.
Awesome. That's great to know. We do have a question about kind of choosing to intervene alone versus working with other stakeholders. If you could maybe offer your thoughts on when it's more effective for a city to intervene independently or when they can leverage other groups like consumer advocates who may have aligned interests.
Yeah, I'm going to just offer that we have been in both. And so we have an association here of municipal entities that intervene in cases. And so we'll see if there's shared interests. Streetlights are one where we had a lot of commonality across the political spectrum. And so we work with this third party. We have to give testimony. We used to give money to help them intervene, cover their costs. So there are certain issues that it makes sense because they're shared. There are also, however, issues that are unique. And in our case, we have one of the most aggressive climate goals in the country. And so we are very vocal about it. Relationships matter a lot. Everyone knows. If you're in Michigan, you know what our goals are. And so we wouldn't have a lot of people standing beside us and pushing really, really hard for renewables faster on the grid. We would have people pushing for really smart renewables, but we're making arguments that are, dare I say, transformational for our utilities and very hard for them to want to receive with open arms. So
Yeah.
there are times that we make the decision to go alone. We'll call the AG, we'll call other advocates. We do make sure, like, are we aligned? But there's also been cases, and I know we're not in this one, but an agreed tariff one where we were confident everyone else was wrong and everyone was fighting us. And we eventually got them to see, no, the math was wrong. Like we were right. The math was wrong and it would have led to a double count. So it's not always kumbaya, right? Like it can be, it's not mean. I just want to be clear. Everyone's very nice in these cases, but it can be tense.
Yes. Yeah. And I just doubled like it's a matter, I think, of resources. If you have the resources to go alone and you have a strong point of view that maybe others don't have, that's amazing. If you don't have the resources, but you have alignment with others who you might be able to pool resources, great. So it's just resources alignment, I think, are the two things to really consider.
Awesome. And we are nearing end of time, but just wanted to end maybe with one piece of advice that you would give a local government that's thinking about engaging in a rate case and hasn't before.
I think it's the ending slide, which is you have a really unique perspective, and that is that of the ratepayer. You are protecting, I mean, local governments protect public health, safety, and general welfare. That voice matters. You don't need to be an expert on everything, be an expert on what you know.
Yeah, I would say we have streamlined the issues that we've gone in on and we've had more success doing that. I think early on we were trying to sort of attack everything that we had an issue, a problem with. And it just led to, it was like scattershot. We've narrowed it down to the fewer issues that we we will be more impactful on, and we've had more of an impact. So like do a more focused engagement, more focused intervention.
Great. Thank you both so much for being on today. I really appreciate it. So we will go ahead and wrap up for today. I know we covered a lot of ground in a relatively short period of time. So we wanted to leave you with a few resources about rate case proceedings if you're interested to dive a little bit deeper. We do also recommend that you search your own state's commission websites to better understand the specifics of rate cases in your jurisdiction. As we've mentioned and has been in a couple of the questions, it can vary quite a bit state to state. So getting that local context is important. Next slide. We do also want to offer an early save the date for our next webinar in this series, which will focus on local government engagement in integrated resource plans. That webinar will take place on Thursday, April 30th from 3 to 4 Eastern Time, and we'll have more information in the registration link in the next couple of weeks. Next slide. If you have any lingering questions, please feel free to reach out to Ian or myself, and our emails are listed on the slides. And finally, we'll give a quick plug. If you're not signed up for our US Clean Energy Pulse newsletter, you can sign up at the link, which we've also put into the chat to hear about recent WRI publications, upcoming webinars, and other news and policy updates. Next slide. So with that, thank you again so much for your attendance today, and we hope to see you on the next webinar in April.